Wow, it looks like we're here. Let's see. Let's see what we got in the way of tens. Okay, sounds pretty good. Yeah. Mm. See what our text to allow is going to
A History of the Philippines. B.Y. David P. Barrows, Ph.D. Professor and Dean of the Grad 8 School in the University of California, formerly Director of Education for the Philippine Islands. II. Yonkers O. N. Hudson, New York. World Book Company 1911. Copyright, 1905, by David P. Barrows, entered at Stationers' Hall, London. No. Preface. This book has been prepared at the suggestion of the educational authorities for pupils in the public high schools of the Philippines, as an introduction to the history of their country. Its preparation occupied about 2 years, while the author was busily engaged in other duties, much of it being written while he was traveling or exploring in different parts of the archipelago. No pretensions are made to an exhaustive character for the book. For the writer, as well as for the pupil for whom it is intended, it is an introduction to the study of the history of Malaysia. Considerable difficulty has been experienced in securing the necessary historical sources, but it is believed that the principal ones have been read. The author is greatly indebted to the Honorable Dr. Pardo de Tavera for the use of rare volumes from his library, and he wishes to acknowledge also the kindness of Mr. Manuel Iriart, Chief of the Bureau of Archives, for permission to examine uncovered documents. The occasional reprints of the old Philippine histories have, however, been used more frequently than the original editions. The splendid series of reprinted works on the Philippines, promised by Miss Blair and Mr. Robertson, was not begun in time to be used in the preparation of this book. The appearance of this series will make easy a path which the present writer 1. 2. Preface has found comparatively difficult, and will open the way for an incomparably better history of the Philippines than has ever yet been made. The drawings of ethnographic subjects, which partly illustrate this book, were made from objects in the Philippine Museum by Mr. Anselmo Estorichu, a teacher in the public schools of Manila. They are very accurate.
Alright.
Above everyone else, in writing this book, the author is under obligations to his wife, without whose constant help and encouragement it could not
Let's
have been
get
written.
busy.
David P. Barrows. Manila, Philippine Islands, MADCH 1st, 1903. Preface to the second edition. The first edition of this book, which appeared in the summer of 1905, has been exhausted for some time, and another issue seems called for. The book has received some severe criticism, especially for its treatment of the work of the Roman Catholic Church and the policy pursued at times by the Spanish government. I have carefully reviewed all of these criticisms that came to my attention and have concluded that, almost without exception, the statements should remain as first presented. The book, therefore, appears again practically without alteration, except for the correction of typographical errors and the occasional modification of a paragraph. On the other hand, several friends, who have been good enough to read the volume, have urged that it be rewritten on a more extended plan, allowing larger treatment to certain topics. I have not done this, for 2 reasons. First, preface 3. Because of the lack of requisite leisure. Second, because some further time must yet elapse before certain indispensable material is available. This includes the completion of the source publications by Miss Blair and Mr. Robertson, the Philippine Islands, now issued up to volume XLIX. The publication of the insertions and reports. And especially the bringing to light or better ordering of material, both private and official, bearing on the last decades of Spanish rule. The period of 1860 to 1898 is one of constant interest. It covers the period when the Spanish government was trying to reform its administration in keeping with the progress of the islands. When the forces of reaction were persistently triumphant. And when the rapidly expanding development of the people itself constantly resulted in larger aspirations. Some of the most salutary lessons of colonial history are contained in this epoch. What the Spanish government then faced, other colonial powers will surely be facing. And the history of this period of unrest and transition can hardly be written too large. This is the portion of the present volume for which I feel apology is most due. However, I will say again, this book is only an introduction to the history of the Philippines under Spanish and American rule. It may be added further, that some few years more must elapse before the work of America in the Philippines can be properly presented. The view given in chapter XIIs of the American government at the time of its organization and first efforts. 5 years have since elapsed, and in the brief period remarkable results have been attained, which must, however, be carried STID further before their full consequence will be disclosed. There has been as or preface. Which between the races a new standard of relationship are far more important than any tangible results. The spirit of the effort has been aptly characterized by a most competent French critic as the substitution of the principle of partnership for that of domination. It marks an advance in the intercourse of races for which the world is most in need. The successful establishment of this principle in the government of the Philippines will be sufficient to set the achievements of the first American civil governor beside the greatest results of administrators of foreign colonies. By the time these pages appear, the Filipino people will have chosen a representative legislative assembly with a legal capacity, for the first time in the history of the islands, to express the general desire and will. It goes without saying that its voice will have great weight with the American nation. What will it demand? The program of an independent Philippines under the disinterested protection of the United States would seem to be an impossibility. No nation, least of all America, with her traditional aversion to foreign complications, would undertake to guarantee the integrity or the internal peace of the Philippines without an adequate control of the administration. As long as America bears any responsibility for the Philippines, the ultimate administrative authority must be with those of her own choosing. Complete independence, freeing America definitely from all burden and further interest, is on the other hand an intelligible program and admissible among practical policies. But the greatest peril of the archived labor lies in the possibility of the Philippine Assembly seeking this separation and in the disposition of the Phase 5. American people to welcome such a solution. Separation too early realized would lead to disaster. There is no shortcut to Philippine nationality. Its attainment is a long task, calling for infinite patience and self-control. The population must greatly increase and must effectively occupy the entire archipelago. Satisfactory relations with the pagan and Mohammedan peoples must be established. Education must do its work, and the social order be entirely transformed before the basis of national life is laid. Yet the aspiration for national existence cannot justly be discouraged. It is the motive power under which the greatest and popular triumphs have been achieved. The situation is one peculiarly delicate and yet full of the greatest promise. There is every reason why both Americans and Filipinos should hold to their task with constant devotion and watchfulness over self. There could be no better motto for all who are engaged in this undertaking than the words of the present Secretary of War, on whom, more than on any other man, rests the immediate future of the Philippines. In my view, a duty is an entirety, and it is not fulfilled until it is entirely fulfilled. David P. Villos. The University of California, May, 1907. Intense. Page. I. The Philippines as a subject for historical study. 9. N. The peoples of the Philippines 25. I. Europe and the Far East about 1400 AD 42. IV. The Great Geographical Discoveries 61. V. Filipino people before the arrival of the Spaniards. 88. VI. The Spanish soldier and the Spanish missionary. 108. VII. Period of conquest and settlement, 1565 to 1600. 125 VII. The Philippines 300 years ago. .156. IX. The Dutch and Moro Wars, 1600 to 1663 187. XA Century of Obscurity and Decline, 1663 to 1762. 212 Xi. The Philippines during the period of European Revolution, 1762 to 1837. 231. XII. Progress and Revolution, 1837 to 1897 259. XII. America and the Philippines 287. Appendix 321. Index 325. List of maps. Philippine Islands 6, 7 countries and peoples of Malaysia 26, 27. Races and peoples of the Philippines 30. The spread of Mohammedanism 39 Europe about 1400 AD. 44 routes of trade to the Far East 50 the countries of the Far East. In the 16th century. 58. Restoration of Toscanelli's map 69 early Spanish discoveries in the Philippines. 77. The New World and the Indies was divided between Spain and Portugal. 85. Conquest and settlement by the Spaniards in the Philippines, 1565 to 1590 124. Straits of Manila 133. The city of Manila 134. Luzon 18 159. Mindanao, Batangas, and Palawan, Nicaragua 288 289. American Camp MGMS in Northern Luzon 302. 8. History of the Philippines. Chapter 1. The Philippines as a subject for historical study. Purpose of this book. This book has been written for the young men and young women of the Philippines. It is intended to introduce them to the history of their own island country. The subject of Philippine history is much broader and more splendid than the size and character of this other book reveal. Many subjects have only been briefly touched upon, and there are many sources of information, old histories, letters and official documents, which the writer had not time and opportunity to study in the preparation of this work. It is not too soon, however, to present a history of the Philippines, even though imperfectly written, to the Philippine people themselves. And if this book serves to direct young men and YOIMG women to a study of the history of their own island town tribe, it will have fulfilled its purpose. The development of the Philippines and of Japan. In many ways the next decade of the history of the Philippine Islands may resemble the splendid development of the neighboring country of Japan. Both countries have in past times been isolated more or less from the life and thoughts of the modern world. Both are now open to the full current of human affairs. Both countries promise to play an important part in the politics and commerce of 9. 10. The Philippines. The Far East. Geographically, the Philippines occupy the more central and influential position, and the success of the institutions of the Philippines may react upon the countries of Southeastern Asia and Malaysia to an extent that we cannot appreciate or foresee. Japan, by reason of her larger population, the greater industry of her people, a more orderly social life, and devoted public spirit, is at the present time far in the lead. The Philippines. BTIT. The Philippines possess certain advantages which, in the course of some years, may tell strongly in her favor. There are greater natural resources, a richer soil, and more tillable ground. The population, while not large, is increasing rapidly, in fact, as the population of Japan or of Java. And in the character of her institutions the Philippines have certain advantages. The position of woman, while unfortunate in Japan, as in China and nearly all Eastern countries, in the Philippines is most fortunate, and is certain to tell effectually upon the advancement of the race in competition with other Eastern civilizations. The fact that Christianity is the established religion of the people makes possible AS5 sympathy and understanding between the Philippines and Western countries. Japan. Yet there are many lessons which Japan can teach the Philippines, and one of these is of the advantages and rewards of fearless and thorough study. 50 years ago, Japan, which had rigorously excluded all intercourse with foreign nations, was induced to open its doors by an American fleet under Commodore Perry. At that time, the Japanese knew little of Western history and had no knowledge of modern science. Their contact with the Americans and other foreigners revealed to them the inferiority of their knowledge. The leaders of the country, a subject of historical study H, awoke to the necessity of a study of Western countries and their achievements, especially in government and in the sciences. Japan had at her service a special class of people known as the samurai, who, in the life of old Japan, were the free soldiers of the feudal nobility, and who were not only the fighters of Japan, but the students and scholars as well. The young men of the samurai class threw themselves earnestly and devotedly into the study of the great fields of knowledge, which had previously been unknown to the Japanese. At great sacrifice, many of them went abroad to other lands, in order to study in foreign universities. Numbers of them went to the United States, frequently working as servants in college towns in order to procure the means for the pursuit of their education. The Japanese government in every way began to adopt measures for the transformation of the knowledge of the people. Schools were opened, laboratories established, and great numbers of scientific and historical books were translated into Japanese. A public school system was organized, and finally a university is established. The government sent abroad many young men to study in almost every branch of knowledge and to return to the service of the people. The manufacturers of Japan studied and adopted Western machinery and modern methods of production. The government itself underwent revolution and reorganization upon lines more liberal to the people and more favorable to the national spirit of the country. The result has been the transformation, in less than 50 years, of what was formerly an isolated and ignorant country. The lesson for the Filipinos. This is the great lesson which Japan teaches the Philippines. If there is to be transformation here, with a constant growth of 12 the Philippines, knowledge and advancement, and an elevation of the character of the people as a whole, there must be a power in this and out in the search for the truth, and the young men and young women of the Philippines must seek the advantages of education, not for themselves, but for the benefit of their people and their land. Not to gain for themselves a selfish position of social and economic advantage over the poor and less educated Filipinos, but in order that, having gained these advantages for themselves, they may in turn give them to their less fortunate COFs and countrymen. The young Filipino, man or woman, must learn the lessons of truthfulness, courage, and unselfishness, and in all of his gaining of knowledge, and in his use of it as well, he must practice these virtues, or his learning will be an evil to his land and not a blessing. The aim of this book is to help him to understand, first of all, the place that the Philippines occupy in the muddy history of nations, so that he may understand how far and from what beginnings the Filipino people have progressed, toward what things the outside world itself has moved during this time, and what place and opportunities the Filipinos, as a people, seek for in the future. Meaning of history. History, as it is written and understood, comprises many centuries of human life and achievement, and we must begin our study by discussing what history means. Men may live for thousands of years without having a life that may be called historical. For history is formed only where there are credible written records of events. Until we have these records, we have no ground for historical study, but leave the field to another study, which we call archaeology, or prehistoric culture. Historical races. Thus there are great races WHICL, a subject of historical study. 13. Have no history, for they have left no records. Either the people could not write, or their writings have been destroyed, or they told nothing about the life of the people. The history of these races began only with the coming of a historical, or more advanced race among them. Thus, the history of the black, or Negro, race begins only with the exploration of Africa by the white race, and the history of the American Indians, except perhaps of those of Peru and Mexico, begins only with the white man's conquest of America. The white, or European, race is, above all others, the great historical race. But the yellow race, represented by the Chinese, has also a historical life and development, beginning many centuries before the birth of Christ. For thousands of years the history of the white race was confined to countries bordering or adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea. There was little contact with other races of men and almost no knowledge of countries beyond the Mediterranean shores. The great continents of America and Australia and the beautiful island world of the Pacific and Indian Oceans were scarcely dreamed of. This was the status of the white race in Europe more than 500 years ago. How different is the position of this race today? It has now explored nearly the entire globe. The white people have crossed every continent and every sea. On every continent they have established colonies and over many countries their power. During these last 5 centuries, besides this spread of geographical discovery, the mingling of all the races, and the founding of great colonies, have come also the development of scientific knowledge, great discoveries and inventions, the utilization of steam and electricity, which give to man such tremendous power over the material world. 14. The Philippines. Very important changes also have marked the religious and political life of the race. Within these years came the Protestant revolt from the Roman Catholic Church, destroying in some degree the unity of Christendom. And the great revolutions in Europe and America, establishing democratic and representative governments. This expansion and widening of the life of the European race, beginning about 500 years ago, brought it into contact with the Filipino people, and the historical life of the Philippines dates from this meeting of the two races. Thus the history of the Philippines has become a part of the history of nations. During these centuries the people of these islands, subjects of a European nation, have progressed in social life and government, in education and industries, in numbers, and in wealth. They have often been stirred by wars and revolutions, by centuries of piratical invasion, and fear of conquest by foreign nations. But these dangers have now passed away. There is no longer fear of piratical ravage nor of foreign invasion, nor is there longer great danger of internal revolt. For the Philippines are at the present time under a government strong enough to defend them against other powers, to put down plunder and ravage, and one anxious and disposed to afford to the people such freedom of opportunity, such advantages of government and life, that the incentive to internal revolution will no longer exist. Secure from external attack and rapidly progressing toward internal peace, the Philippines occupy a position most fortunate among the peoples of the Far East. They have representative government, freedom of religion, and good public education, and, what is more than all else to the aspiring or ambitious race or individual, freedom of accord unity. A subject of vestigial study. 15. how history is written. One other thing should be explained here. Every child who reads this book should understand a little how history is written. A most natural inquiry to be made regarding any historical statement is, how is this known? And this is as proper a question for the schoolboy as for the statesman. The answer is, that history rests for its facts largely upon the written records made by people who either lived at the time these things took place, or so near to them that, by careful inquiry, they could learn accurately of these matters and write them down in some form, so that we today can read their accounts, and at least know how these events appeared to men of the time. But not all that a man writes, or even puts in a book, of things he has seen and known, is infallibly accurate and free from error, partiality, and untruthfulness. So the task of the historian is not merely to read and accept all the contemporary records, but he must also compare one account with another, weighing all that he can find, making due allowance for prejudice, and on his own part try to reach a conclusion that shall be true. Of course, where records are few the task is difficult indeed, and, on the other hand, material may be so voluminous as to occupy a writer a lifetime, and make it impossible for any one man completely to exhaust a subject. Historical accounts of the Philippines. For the Philippines we are so fortunate as to have many adequate sources of a reliable and attractive kind. In a few words some of these will be described. Nearly all exist in at least a few libraries in the Philippines, where they may sometime be consulted by the Filipino student, and many of them, at least in later editions, may be purchased by the student for his own possession and study. 16. T. Philippines. The Voyages of Discovery. European discovery of the Philippines began with the Great Voyage of Magellan. And recounting this discovery of the islands, there is a priceless narrative of one of Magellan's
Almost was a duck
Antonio
in this
Pigafetta.
stupid robot.
His book was written in Italian, but was first published in a French translation. The
I
original
like the
copies made by
duck.
Pigafetta have disappeared, but in 1800 the text was discovered in the Ambrosian Library of Milan, Italy, and published. Translations into English and other languages exist. It may be found in several collections of voyages, and there is a good Spanish translation and edition of recent date. There are several other accounts of Magellan's voyage. But Pigafetta's was the best one written by an eyewitness, and his descriptions of the Visayas Islands, Cebu, Borneo, and the Moluccas are wonderfully interesting and accurate. There were several voyages of discovery between Magellan's time 1521 and Legazpi's time 1565. These include the expeditions of Losa, Saavedra, and Baywala Bas. Accounts of them are to be found in Volume 5 of the series of publications made by the Spanish government, Colección de Documentos y Negros del Archivo de Indias. In another series, Colección de los Viajes y Descubrimientos, are the documents of Magellan's voyage. Spanish occupation and conquest. As we come to the history of Spanish occupation and conquest of the Philippines, we find many interesting letters and reports sent by both soldiers and priests to the king, or to persons in Spain. The first complete book on the Philippines was written by a missionary about 1602, Father Pedro Chirinos Relachidon de los Islas Filipinas, printed in Rome. El Primer Viajero del Mundo, por Antonio Pigafetta, traducido por Dr. Carlos Amoretti y anotado por Manuel y Marino, Madrid, 1899. A subject of historical study. 17. In 1604. This important and curious narrative is exceedingly rare, but a reprint, although wood and poor, was made in Manila in 1890, which is readily obtainable. The Relachidon de los Islas Filipinas was followed in 1609 by the work of Judge Antonio de Morda, Susos de los Islas Filipinas. This very rare work was printed in Mexico. In 1890 a new edition was brought out by Dr. Joe Six Riesel, from the copy in the British Museum. There is also an English translation. These two works abound in curious and valuable information upon the Filipino people as they were at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, as does also a later work, The Conquistas de los Islas Filipinas, by Friar Gaspar de San Agustin, printed in Madrid in 1698. This latter is perhaps the most interesting and most important early work on the P.H. Whitney Islands. As we shall you see, the history of the Philippines is closely connected with that of the East Indian Spice Islands. When the Spanish forces took the rich island of Timor in 1606, the triumph was commemorated by a volume, finely written, though not free from mistakes, The Conquista de los Islas Moluccas, by Leonardo de Argensola, Madrid, 1609. There is an Old English translation, and also French and Dutch translations. To no other religious order do we owe so much historical information as to the Jesuits. The scholarship and literary ability of the company have always been high. Quirino was a Jesuit, as was also Father Francisco Colin, who wrote the Liber Evangelica, a narrative of the Jesuit missions in the Philippines, China, and Japan, which was printed in Madrid in 1663. This history was continued years later by Father Merlo Velarde, who wrote what he called the Segunda Part, the Historia de la Provincia de Filipinas de la Compañía de Jesus, Manila, 1749. 18. The Philippines. There is another notable Jesuit work to which we owe much of the early history of the great island of Mindanao. This is the Historia de Mindanao y Jolo, by Father Francisco Combos. The year 1663 marked, as we shall see, an epoch in the relations between the Spaniards and the Mohammedan Malays. In that year the Spaniards abandoned the fortress of Zamboanga, and retired from Southern Mindanao. The Jesuits had been the missionaries in those parts of the southern archipelago, and they made vigorous protests against the abandonment of Moro territory. One result of their efforts to secure the reoccupancy of these fortresses was the notable work mentioned above. It is the oldest and most important writing about the island and the inhabitants of Mindanao. It was printed in Madrid in 1667. A beautiful and exact edition was brought out a few years ago, by Ratana. A Dominican missionary, Father Diego Dior, wrote a very important work, the Historia de la Provincia del Santo Rosario de la Orden de Predicadores en Filipinas, Jap 6 NY China, which was printed in Manila at the College of Santo Tomas in 1640. We may also mention as containing a most interesting account of the Philippines about the middle of the 17th century, the famous work on China, by the Dominican, Father Fernandez Navarrete, Tratados Históricos, Políticos, Étnicos, y Religiosos de la Monarquía de China, Madrid, 1767. Navarrete arrived in these islands in 1648, and was for a time a cura on the island of Mindoro. Later he was a missionary in China, and then professor of divinity in the University of Santo Tomas. His work is translated into English in Churchill's collection of Voyages and Travels, London, 1744, second volume. The 18th century is rather barren of interesting. A subject of historical study. 19. Historical matter. There was considerable activity in the production of grammars and dictionaries of the native languages, and more histories of the Refcus orders were also produced. These latter, while frequently filled with sectarian matter, should not be overlooked. Between the years 1788 and 1792 was published the voluminous Historia General de Filipinos, in 14 volumes, by the Recollect friar, Father Juan de la Concepcion. The work adorns in superfluous matter and trivial details, yet it is a copious source of information, a veritable mine of historical data, and is perhaps the best known and most frequently used work upon the Philippine Islands. There are a number of sets in the Philippines which can be consulted by the student. Some years after, and as a sort of protest against so extensive a treatment of history, the same and admirable Augustinian, Father Joaquin Martinez de Zuniga, wrote his Historia de los Islas Filipinas, a volume of about 700 pages. It was printed in Sambalak, Manila, in 1803. This writer is exceptional for his fair-mindedness and freedom from the narrow prejudices which have characterized most of the writers on the Philippines. His language is terse and spirited, and his volume is the most readable and, in many ways, the most valuable attempt at a history of the Philippines. His narrative closes with the English occupation of Manila in 1763. Recent histones and other historical materials. The sources for the conditions and history of the islands during the last century differ somewhat from the pressing. The documentary sources in the form of public papers and reports are available, and there is a considerable mass of pamphlets dealing with special questions in the Philippines. The publication of the official journal of 20 the Philippines. The government, the Gazeta de Manila, commenced in 1861. It contains all acts of legislation, orders of the governors, pastoral letters, and other official matters, down to the end of Spanish rule. A vast amount of material for the recent civil history of the islands exists in the archives of the Philippines, at Manila, but these documents have been very httlex-9. Notable among these original documents is the series of Royal C6 duets, each bearing the signature of the King of Spain, Yo, El Rey. They run back from the last years of sovereignty to the commencement of the 17th century. The early sea duets, on the establishment of Spanish rule, are said to have been carried away by the British Army in 1763, and to be now in the British Museum. Of the archives of the Royal Audiencia at Manila, the series of judgments begins with one of 1603, which is signed by Antonio de Morga. From this date they appear to be complete. The earliest records of the cases which came before this court that can be found, date from the beginning of the 18th century. Of modern historical writings, mention must be made of the Historia de Filipinas, 3 volumes, 1887, by Montero Y. Vidal, and the publications of W. E. Ratana. To the scholarship and enthusiasm of this last author much is owed. His work has been the republication of rare and important sources. His edition of Combos has already been mentioned, and there should also be mentioned, and if possible procured, his Archivo del Bibliopilo Filipino, 4 volumes, a collection of rare papers on the islands, of different dates. And his edition, the first ever published, of Zurigasismo de los Islas Filipinas, an incomparable survey of the islands made about 1800, by the priest and historian whose history was mentioned above. A subject for historical study. 21. Accounts of voyagers who visited the Philippines. These references give some idea of the historical tour of the Philippines. They comprise those works which should be chiefly consulted. There should not be omitted the numerous accounts of voyagers who visited these islands from time to time, and who frequently give us very valuable information. The first of these are perhaps the English and Dutch freebooters, who prowled about these waters to waylay the richly laden galleons. One of these was Dampier, who, about 1690, visited the Ladrones and the Philippines. His new voyage around the world was published in 1697. There was also Anson, who in 1743 took the Spanish galleon off the coast of Samar, and whose voyage is described in a volume published in 1745. There was an Italian physician, Carreri, who visited the islands in 1697, in the course of a voyage around the world, and who wrote an excellent description of the Philippines, which is printed in English translation in Churchill's collection of voyages. A French expedition visited the East between 1774 and 1781, and the commissioner, M. Sonnerat, has left a brief account of the Spanish settlements in the islands as they then appeared. Voyage Owens or Entails at H. Log Hein, Paris, 1782, Volume 3. There are a number of travelers' accounts written in the last century, of which may be mentioned Sir John Bowring's visit to the Philippine Islands, 1859, and Jaggers Rising and Der Philippinen, travels in the year 1859 and 1860, which has received translation into both English and Spanish. Bibliographies. For the historical student, a bibliographical guide is necessary. Such a volume was brought out in 1898, by Ratana, Catalogo Abreviado de la Biblioteca. 22 The Philippines. Filipina. It contains a catalog of 5,780 works, pub HSHED in Oripon Philippines. A still more exact and useful bibliography has been prepared by the Honorable T.H. Hardo de Tavera, Biblioteca Filipina, and is published by the United States government. It is lamentable that the Philippines government possesses no HBRA or Y of works on the archipelago. The foundation of such an institution seems to have been quite neglected by the Spanish government, and works on the Philippines are scarcely to be found, except as they exist in private collections. The largest of these is said to be that of the Company of General de Tabagos, at Barcelona, which has also recently possessed itself of the splendid HBRA or Y of Ratana. In Manila, the Honorable Dr. Pardo de Tavera possesses the only notable library in the islands. The publication of a very extensive series of sources of Philippine history has also been begun by the Arthur H. Clark Company in the United States, under the editorship of Miss E. H. Blair and Mr. J. A. Robertson. The series will embrace 55 volumes, and will contain in English translations all available historical material on the Philippines, from the age of discovery to the 19th century. This notable collection will place within the reach of the student all the important sources of his country's history, and will make possible a more extensive and accurate writing of the history of the islands than has ever before been possible. Since the above was written, the Philippines government has commenced the collection of historic works in the Philippines, and the talented young Filipino scholar, Mr. Zaluda, has gone to Spain for extensive search, both of archives and libraries, in order to enrich the public collection in the Philippines. A subject Bob Historical Study. 23. In addition to the published works, there repose numerous unstudied documents of Philippine history in the archives of the Indies as a bill. Historical work for the Filipino student. After reading this book, or a similar introductory history, the student should procure, one by one, as many as he can of the volumes which have been briefly described above, and, by careful reading and patient thought, try to round out the story of his country and learn the lessons of the history of his people. He will find it a study that will stimulate his thought and strengthen his judgment. But always he must search for the truth, even though the truth is sometimes humiliating and sad. If there are regrettable passages in our own lives, we cannot find either happiness or improvement in trying to deny to ourselves that we have done wrong, and so conceal and minimize our error. So if there are dark places in the history of our land and people, we must not obscure the truth in the mistaken belief that we are defending our people's honor, for, by trying to conceal the fact and excuse the fault, we only add to the shame. It is by frank acknowledgement and clear depiction of previous errors that the country's honor will be protected now and in the future. Very interesting and important historical work can be done by the Filipino student in his own town or province. The public and parish records have in many towns suffered fear, neglect, or destruction. In all possible cases, these documents should be gathered up and cared for. For many things, they are worthy of study. They may show the growth of population, the dates of erection of the public buildings, the former system of government, and social conditions. This is a work in which the patriotism of every young 24 TME Philippines man and woman can find an expression. Many sites throughout the islands are notable for the historic occurrences which they witnessed. These should be suitably marked with tablets or memes, and the exact facts of the events that took place should be carefully collected and put in writing. Towns and provinces should form public libraries containing, among other works, books on the Philippines. And it should be a matter of pride to the young Filipino scholar to build up such local institutions, and to educate his townsmen in their use and appreciation. But throughout such studies, the student should remember that his town or locality is of less importance, from a patriotic standpoint, than his country as a whole. That the interests of one section should never be placed above those of the archipelago. And that, while his first and foremost duty is to his town and to his people, among whom he was born and nurtured, he owes a greater obligation to his whole country and people, embracing many different islands and different tongues, and to the great government which holds and protects the Philippine Islands, and which is making possible the free development of its inhabitants. Chapter 2: The Peoples of the Philippines. The study of ethnology. The study of races and peoples forms a separate science from history, and is known as ethnology, or the science of races. Ethnology treats of how and where the different races of mankind originated. It explains the relationships between the races as well as the differences of mind, of body, and of mode of living which different peoples exhibit. All such knowledge is of great assistance to the statesman as he deals with the affairs of his own people and of other peoples, and it helps private individuals of different races to understand one another and to treat each other with due respect, kindness, and sympathy. Inasmuch, too, as the modern history which we are studying deals with many different peoples of different origin and race, and as much of our history turns upon these differences, we must look for a little at the ethnology of the Philippines. The Negritos. Physical characteristics. The great majority of the natives of our islands belong to what is usually called the Malayan race, or the Oceanic Mongols. There is, however, one interesting little race scattered over the Philippines, which certainly has no relationship at all with Malayans. These little people are called by the Tagalog, Ida or Ida. The Spaniards, when they arrived, called them Negritos, or Little Negroes, the name by which they are best known. Since they 25 110 longitude east 12 2G 28 the Philippines were without question the first inhabitants of these islands of whom we have any knowledge, we shall speak of them at once. They are among the very smallest peoples in the world, the average height of the men being about 145 centimeters, or the height of an American boy of 12 years. The women are correspondingly smaller. They have such dark brown skins that many people suppose them to be quite black. Their hair is very woolly or kinky, and forms pigments upon their heads. In spite of these peculiarities, they are not unattractive in appearance. Their eyes are large and of a fine brown color, their features are quite regular, and their little bodies often relatively shaped. The appearance of these little savages excited the attention of the first Spaniards, and there are many early accounts of them. Padre Chirino, who went as a missionary in 1592 to May, begins the narrative of his labors in the island as follows. Among the Bisayas, there are also some Negroes. They are less black and ugly than those of Guinea, and they are much smaller and weaker, but their hair and beard are just the same. They are much more barbarous and wild than the Bisayas and other Filipinos, for they have neither houses nor any fixed sites for dwelling. They neither plant nor reap, but lie like wild beasts, wandering with their wives and children through the mountains, almost naked. They hunt the deer and wild boar, and when they kill one they stop right there until all the flesh is consumed. Of property they have nothing except the bow and arrow. Manners and customs. The Negritos still have this wild, timid character, and few have ever been truly Silverlachi and de los Islas Filipinas. 2 Died, pages 38. TBE Peoples of the Philippines. 29. Allies in spite of the efforts of some of the Spanish missionaries. They still roam through the mountains, seldom building houses, but making simply a little wall and roof of brush to keep off the wind and rain. They kill deer, wild pigs, monkeys, and birds, and in hunting they are very expert. But their principal food is wild fruit and tubers, which they roast in ashes. Frequently in traveling through the mountains, although one may see nothing of these timid little folk, he will see many large, freshly dug holes from each of which they have taken out a root. The The Negritos ornament their bodies by making little rows of cuts on the breast, back, and arms, and leaving the scars in ornamental patterns. And some of them also cut their front teeth to points. In their hair they wear bamboo combs with long plumes of hair or the feathers of the mountain hawk. They have curious dances, and ceremonies for marriage and for death. Distribution. The Negritos have retired from many places where they lived when the Spaniards first arrived, but there are still several thousand in LJN, especially in the Cordilleras Andes, and in the Sierra Madre range on the Pacific coast, and in the interior of Panay and Negros, and in Surigao of Mindanao. LUON of the J. Negritos to other dwarfs of the world. Although the Negritos have had very little effect on the history of the Philippines, they are of much interest as a race to scientists, and we cannot help asking, whence came these curious little people, and what does their presence here signify? While science cannot at present fully answer these questions, what we do actually know about these pygmies is full of interest. The Itas of the Philippines are not the only black dwarfs in the world. A similar little people, who must T peoples of the Philippines. 31. Belong to the same race, live in the mountains and jungles of the Malay Peninsula and are called Samangs. On the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, all the aboriginal inhabitants are similar pygmies. Some traces of their former existence are reported from many other places in the East Indies. Thus it may be that there was a time when these little men and women had much of this island world quite to themselves, and their race stretched unbrokenly from the Philippines across Malaysia to the Indian Ocean. As it would have been impossible for so few people to force their way from one island to another after the arrival of the stronger races, who have now confined them to the mountainous interiors, we are obliged to believe that the Negritos were on the ground first, and that at one time they were more numerous. The Indian archipelago was then a world of black pygmies. It may be that they were even more extensive than this, for one of the most curious discoveries of modern times has been the finding of similar little blacks in the equatorial forests of Africa. The Negritos must not be confused with the black or Negro race of New Guinea or Melanesia, who are commonly called Papuans. For those Negroes are of tall stature and belong with the true Negroes of Africa, though how the Negro race thus came to be formed of several widely separated branches we do not know. The Malayan race. Origin of the race. It is thought that the Malayan race originated in southeastern Asia. From the mainland it spread down into the peninsula and so scattered southward and eastward over the rich neighboring islands. Probably these early Malayans found the little Negritos in possession in SBWLY 32 to slip vines. Drove them backward, destroying them from many islands until they no longer exist except in the places we have already named. With the beginning of this migratory movement which carried them from one island to another of the great East Indian archipelago, these early Malayans must have invented the boats or prows for which they are famed and have become skillful sailors living much upon the sea. Effect of the migration. Life for many generations, upon these islands, so warm, tropical, and fruitful, gradually modified these immigrants from Asia, until they became in mind and body quite a different race from the Mongol inhabitants of the mainland. Characteristics. The Malayan peoples are of a light brown color, with a light yellowish undertone on some parts the skin, with straight black hair, dark brown eyes, and, though they are a small race in stature, they are finely formed, muscular, and active. The physical type is nearly the same throughout all Malaysia, but the different peoples making up the race differ markedly from one another in culture. They are divided also by differences of religion. There are many tribes which are pagan. On Bali and Lombok, little islands east of Java, the people are Tiu Brahmin, HKE most inhabitants of India. In other parts of Malaysia they are Mohammedans, while in the Philippines alone they are mostly Christians. The wild Malayan tribes. Considering first the pagan or the wild Malayan peoples, we find that in the interior of the Malay Peninsula and of many of the islands, such as Sumatra, Borneo and Celebes, there are wild Malayan tribes, who have come very little in contact with the successive civilizing changes that have passed over this archipelago. The true Malays call these Fogarang, the peoples of the Philippines. 33. The Nua, or men of the country. Many are almost savages, some are cannibals, and others are headhunters like some of the diets of Borneo. In the Philippines, too, we find what is probably the same class of wild people living in the mountains. They are warlike, savage, and resist approach. Sometimes they eat human flesh as a ceremonial act, and some prize above all other trophies the heads of their enemies, which they cut from the body and preserve in their homes. It is probable that these tribes represent the earliest and rudest epoch of Malayan culture, and that these were the first of this race to arrive in the Philippines and dispute with the Negroes for the mastery of the soil. In such wild states of life, some of them, like the Mayans of Mindoro, have continued to the present day. The tribes in northern Luzon. In northern Luzon, in the Great Cordillera Central, there are many of these green-eating tribes. These people are preeminently mountaineers. They prefer the high, cold, and semi-arid crests and valleys of the loftiest ranges. Here, with great industry, they have made gardens by the building of stone wall terraces on the slopes of the hills. Sometimes hundreds of these terraces can be counted in one valley, and they rise one above the other from the bottom of a canyon for several miles almost to the summit of a ridge. These terrace gardens are all under most careful irrigation. Water is carried for many miles by log flumes and ditches, to be distributed over these little fields. The soil is carefully fertilized with the refuse of the villages. 2 and frequently 3 crops are produced each year. Here we find undoubtedly the most developed and most nearly scientific agriculture in the Philippines. They raise rice, cotton, tobacco, taro, maize, and especially milk, corn. 34 the Philippines. Sweet potato, which is their principal food. These people live in compact, well-built villages, frequently of several hundred houses. Some of these tribes, like the Igoro's of Ermitan James of Abra, are peaceable as well as industrious. In Bigot there are fine herds of cattle, much excellent coffee, and from time immemorial the Igoro's steer their wine gold. Besides these peaceful tribes there are in Banta, and in the northern parts of the Cordillera, many large tribes, with splendid mountain villages, who are nevertheless in a constant and dreadful state of war. Nearly every town is imbued with its neighbors, and the practice of taking heads leads to frequent murder and combat. A most curious tribe of persistent headhunters are the Ibayo, or Lumniks, who live in the Caraballos or mountains between Nueva Ecija and Nueva Vizcaya. On other islands of the Philippines there are similar wild tribes. On the island of Palawan there are the Tagbandans and other savage bone. Characteristics of the tribes of Mindanao. In Mindanao, there are many more tribes. 3 of these tribes, the Zagogo, Mandaya, and Manobo, are on the eastern coast and around Point Ago. In western Mindanao, there is quite a large but scattered tribe called Sabanan. These people make clearings on the hillsides and support themselves by raising maize and mounting rice. They also raise hemp, and from the fiber they weave truly beautiful blankets and garments, artistically dyed in very curious patterns. These peoples are nearly all pagans, though a few are being gradually converted to Mohammedanism, and some to Christianity. The pagans optionally practice the revolting rites of human sacrifice and ceremonial cannibalism. The peoples of the Philippines. 35. The civilized Malayan peoples. They later arrival. At a later date than the arrival of these primitive Malayan tribes, there came to the Philippines others on a more developed culture and a higher order of intelligence. These peoples mastered the low country and the coasts of nearly all the islands, driving into the interior the earlier comers and the Aboriginal Negritos. These later arrivals, though all of one stock, differed considerably, and spoke different dialects belonging to one language family. They were the ancestors of the present civilized Filipino people. Distribution of these. Yais. All through the Central Islands, Cebu, Panay, Negros, Leyte, Samar, Bohol and Northern Mindanao, are the Bi/Sais, the largest, of FFB's peoples. At the southern extremity of Luzon, into each sea provinces of Sorsogon and the Common Sea Ratan, Rise, are the Bicals. North of these, holding central Luzon, the Batangas, Kulay, Manila, Laguna, Baytali, Bulacan, and Nueva Ecija, are the Tagalogs, while the Great Plain of northern Luzon is occupied by the Pampangueños and Pangasinans. All the northwest coast is inhabited by the Ilocanos, and the valley of the Cagayan by are people commonly called Cagayanes, but whose dialect is Ibanag. In Nueva Vizcaya province, on the Philippines Islands and the Calamianes, there are other distinct branches of the Filipino people, but they are much smaller in numbers and less important than the tribes mentioned above. 36. The Philippines. Importance of these peoples. They form politically and historically the Filipino people. They are the Filipinos whom the Spaniards ruled for more than 300 years. All are converts to Christianity, and all have attained a somewhat similar stage of civilization. Early contact of the Malays and Hindus. These people at the time of their arrival in the Philippines were probably not only of a higher plane of intelligence than any Mindanao brass vessels, who had preceded them in the occupation of the islands, but they appear to have had the advantages of contact with the highly developed culture that had appeared in the eastern archipelago some centuries earlier. Early civilization in India. More than 2,000 years ago, India produced a remarkable civilization. There were great cities of stone, magnificent palaces, a life of splendid luxury, and a highly organized social and political system. Writing, known as the Sanskrit, had been developed, and a great literature of culture. The peoples of the Philippines. 37. And philosophy produced. 2 great religions, Brahmanism and Buddhism, arose, the latter still the dominant religion of Tibet, China, and Japan. The people who produced this civilization are known as the Hindus. 14 or 1500 years ago Hinduism spread over Burma, Siam, and Java. Great cities were erected with splendid temples and huge idols, the ruins of which still remain, though their magnificence has gone and they are covered today with the growth of the jungle. Influence of Hindu culture on the Malayan peoples. This powerful civilization of the Hindus, established thus in Malaysia, greatly affected the Malayan people on these islands, as well as those who came to the Philippines. Many words in Tagalog have been shown to have a Sanskrit origin, and the systems of writing which the Spaniards found in use among several of the Filipino peoples had certainly been developed from the alphabet then in use among these Hindu peoples of Java. The rise of Mohammedanism. Muhammad. A few hundred years later, another great change, due to religious faith, came over the Malayan race, a change which has had a great effect upon the history of the Philippines, and is still destined to modify events far into the future. This was the conversion to Mohammedanism. Of all the great religions of the world, Mohammedanism was the last to arise, and its career has in some ways been the most remarkable. Muhammad, its founder, was an Arab, born about 572 AD. At that time, Christianity was established entirely around the Mediterranean and throughout most of Europe, but Arabia was idolatrous. Muhammad was one of those great, prophetic souls which arise from time to time in the world's history. All he could learn from. 38. The Philippines. Hebraism and Christianity, together with the result of his own thoughts and prayers, led him to the belief in one God, the Almighty, the Compassionate, the Merciful, who as he believed would all men to his knowledge through the teachings of Muhammad himself. Thus inspired, Mohammed became a teacher or prophet, and by the end of his life he had won his people to his faith and inaugurated one of the greatest eras of conquest the world has seen. Spread of Mojiati and Nevinism to Africa and Europe. The armies of Arabian horsemen, full of fanatical enthusiasm to convert the world to their faith, in a century's time rested from Christendom all Judea, Syria, and Asia Minor, the sacred land where Jesus lived and taught, and the countries where Paul and the other apostles had first established Christianity. Then they swept along the north coast of Africa, bringing to an end all that survived the Roman power and religion, and by 1720 they had crossed into Europe and were in possession of Spain. For the nearly 800 years that followed, the Christian Spaniards fought to drive Mohammedanism from the peninsula, before they were successful. The company version of the Malayan steam Mohammedanism. Not only did Mohammedanism move westward over Africa and Europe, it was carried eastward as well. Animated by their faith, the Arabs became the greatest sailors, explorers, merchants, and geographers of the age. They sailed from the Red Sea down the coast of Africa as far as Madagascar, and eastward to India, where they had settlements over both the Malabar and Coromandel coasts. Then Arab missionaries brought their faith to Malaysia. At that time, the true Malays, the tribe from which the Kanimintar Malayan has been derived, were 40. The Philippines. small people of Sumatra. At least as early as 1250 they were converted to Mohammedanism, brought to them by these Arabian missionaries, and under the impulse of this mighty faith they broke from their obscurity and commenced that great conquest and expansion that has diffused their power, language, and religion throughout the East Indies. Mohammedan settlement in Borneo. A powerful Mohammedan Malay settlement was established on the western coasts of Borneo probably as early as 1400. The more primitive inhabitants, like the Dalits, who were a tribe of the primitive Malayans, were defeated, and the possession of parts of the coast taken from them. From this coast of Borneo came many of the adventurers who were traversing the seas of the Philippines when the Spaniards arrived. The Mohammedan population of Mindanao and Jolo owes something certain to the same Malay migration which founded the colony of Borneo. But the Mindanao and Delaine and Moros seem to be largely descendants of primitive tribes, such as the Monogo and Tiroy, who were converted to Mohammedanism by Malay and Arab proselytes. The traditions of the Mindanao Moros ascribe their conversion to Tabansham, a native of Johor, the son of an Arab father and Malay mother. He came to Mindanao with a band of followers, and from him the daughters of Mindanao trace their lineage. Having then, through his Arab father, is supposed to be descended from Muhammad, and so the daughters of Mindanao to the present day proudly believe that in their veins flows the blood of the Prophet. The coming of the Spaniards. Mohammedanism was still increasing in the Philippines when the Spaniards are. The people of the Philippines. 41. Are dead. The Mohammedans lied of foothold on Manila Bay, and their gradual conquest of the archipelago was interrupted only by the coming of the Europeans. It is a strange historical occurrence that the Spaniards, having fought with the Mohammedans for nearly 8 centuries for the possession of Spain, should have come westward around the globe to the Philippine Islands and there resume the ancient conflict with them. Thus the Spaniards were the most determined opponents of Mohammedanism on both its western and eastern frontiers. Their ancient foes who crossed into Spain from Morocco had been always known as Moros or Moors, and quite naturally they gave to these new Mohammedan enemies the same title, and Moros they are called to the present day. Summary. Such, then, are the elements which form the population of these islands, a few thousands of the little Negritos. Many wild mountain tribes of the primitive Malays. A later immigration of the Malays of higher cultivation and prosperity than any that preceded them, who have been influenced by the Hinduism of Java and who have had in recent centuries an astonishing growth both in numbers and in culture. And last, the fierce Mohammedan sea rovers, the true Malays. Copy of the Quran from Mindanao. Chapter 3. Europe and the Far East about 1400 AD. The medieval period in Europe. Length of the middle of section E. By the Middle Ages we mean the centuries between 500 and 1300 AD. This period begins with the fall of the Roman Empire and the looting of the imperial city by the rude German tribes, and ends with the rise of a new literature, a new way of looking at the world in general, and a passion for discovery of every kind. These 800 years had been centuries of cruel struggle, intellectual darkness, and social depression, but also of great religious devotion. Edward Gibbon, one of the greatest historians, speaks of this period as the triumph of barbarism and religion. The population of Europe was largely changed during the first few centuries of the Christian era, as the Roman Empire, that greatest political institution of all history, slowly decayed. New peoples of German or Teutonic origin came, fighting their way into Western Europe and settling wherever the land attracted them. Thus Spain and Italy received the Goths. France, the Burgundians and Franks. England, the Saxons and Angles or English. These peoples were all fierce, warlike, free, unlettered barbarians. Fortunately, they were all converted to Christianity by Roman priests and missionaries. They embraced this faith with ardor, at the same time that other peoples and lands were being lost to Christendom. Thus it has resulted that the countries wear Christianity. 42. But Europe and the Far East about by 400 AD 43. Arose and first established itself, are now no longer Christian, and this religion, which had an Asiatic and Semitic origin, has become the distinguishing faith of the people of Western Europe. For centuries the countries of Europe were fiercely raided and disturbed by pillaging and murdering hordes. By the Huns, who followed the Germans from the east. By the Northmen, cruel piracy from Scandinavia. And, as we have already seen, by the Mohammedans, or Saracens as they were called, who came into Central Europe by way of Spain. Character of life during this period, feudalism. Life was so beset the peril that independence or freedom became impossible, and there was developed a society which has lasted almost down to the present time, and which we call feudalism. The free but weak man gave of his freedom and his lands to some stronger man, who became his lord. He swore obedience to his lord, while the lord engaged to punish and protection and gave him back his lands to hold as a fief, co-sharing in the product. His lord swore allegiance to some still more powerful man, or a lord, and became his vassal, pledged to follow him to war with a certain number of men. And this overlord, on his part, the lady answered to the prince, who was, perhaps, a duke or bishop. Bishops at this time were also feudal lords, or kings or emperor. Thus were men united into lordships or nations for help or protection. There was little understanding of love of country.
Tase me,
buddy. Disadvantages of feudalism. The great curse of this system was that the feudal lords possessed the power to make war upon one another, and so continue to serve. 44. Europe and the Baptists about 2 AD 45. Their jealousies and quarreling that the land was never free from armed who laid waste and opponents count tried, killing the miserable serfs who tilled the soil, and destroying their homes and cattle. There was little joy in life and no popular learning. If a man did not enjoy warfare, but another life was open to him, and that was in the church. War and religion were the pursuits of life, and it is no wonder that many of the nobles and thus turned their backs upon a life that promised only fighting and bloodshed, and, as the world became monks. Monasticism developed in Europe under such conditions as these, and so strong were the religious feelings of the age that at one time a third of the land of France was owned by the religious orders. The town. The two typical institutions of the early Middle Age were the feudal castle, with its high stone walls and gleaming towers, with its fierce bands of warriors armed and nailed and fighting on horseback with lance and sword, and the monastery, which represented an hospital and school.
Ow,
Gradually,
quit!
However, as third factor appeared. This was the town.
Ouch.
And it is to these medieval cities, with their busy trading life, their free citizenship, and their useful occupations, that the modern world owes much of its liberty and its intellectual might. The Renaissance. Change in political affairs. By 1400, however, the world came under contact with a new idea, a new method of progress, which is called the Renaissance, which means rebirth. In political affairs, the spirit of nationality had arisen, and feudalism was already declining. Men began to feel attachment to country, to king, and to fellow citizens. And the national states, as we now know them, each with its 46 GSE Philippines, materially bounded territory, its common language, and its approximately common race, were appearing. France and England were, of these states, the two most advanced politically just previous to the 15th century. At this distant time they were still engaged in a struggle which lasted quite a century and is known as the 100 Years' War. In the end, England was forced to give up all her claims to territory on the continent, and the power of France was correspondingly increased. In France, the monarchy, king, and court was becoming the supreme power in the land. The feudal nobles lost what power they had, while the common people gained nothing. In England, however, the foundations for representative government had been laid. The powers of legislation and government were divided between the English king and the Parliament. The Parliament was first called in 1265 and consisted of two parts, the Lords, representing the nobility, and the Commons, composed of persons chosen by the common people. Germany was divided into a number of small principalities: Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia, Bohemia, Austria, the Rhine principalities, and many others, which united in a great ascendancy, or diet, the head of which was some prince, chosen to be emperor. Italy was also divided. In the north, in the valley of the Po, or Lombardy, were the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice. South, on the western coast, were the Tuscan states, including the splendid city of Florence. Thence, stretching north and south across the peninsula, were states of the church, whose ruler was the Pope. For until less than 50 years ago, the Pope was not only the head of the church, but also
I just heard you holler.
embracing the southern part of the peninsula was the Principality of
Let's
Naples.
see if I'm gonna
Europe and the Far East
protect
about
you.
you are AD 47.
You wanna
In the
share
Spanish
my
Peninsula.
Root
Christian states had
for me?
arisen
Or you
in the
busy
west,
watching
Portugal,
TV?
in the center and east, Castile, Aragon, and beyond, from all of which the Mohammedans had been expelled. But the Moors still held the southern parts of Spain,
Oh.
including the beautiful plains of Andalusia and Grenada. The Mohammedans, in the centuries of their life in Spain, had developed an elegant and prosperous civilization. By means of irrigation and skillful planting, they had converted southern Spain into a garden. They were the most skillful agriculturalists and breeders of horses and sheep in Europe, and they carried to perfection many fine arts, while knowledge and learning were nowhere further advanced than here. Through contact with this remarkable people, the Christian standards gained much. Unfortunately, however, the spirit of religious intolerance was so strong, and the hatred engendered by the centuries of religious war was so violent, that in the end the Spaniard became imbued with so fierce a fanaticism that he thereafter appeared unable properly to appreciate or justly to treat those who differed from him in religious belief. The conquests of the Mohammedans. In the 15th century, religious toleration was but little known in the world, and the people of the great Mohammedan faith still threatened to overwhelm Christian Europe. Since the first great conquests of Islam in the 8th century had been repulsed from Central Europe, the faith had shown a wonderful power of winning its way. In the 10th century, Asia Minor was invaded by hordes of Seljuks, or Turks, who poured down from Central Asia in conquering bands. These tribes had overthrown the Arabs' power in Mesopotamia and Asia Minor only to become converts to his faith. With Prussian zeal, 48 the Philippines hurled themselves upon the old Christian empire, which at Constantinople had survived the fall of the rest of the Roman world. The Crusades. The Seljuk Turks had conquered most of Asia Minor, Syria, and the Holy Land. A great fear came over the people and earth that the city of Constantinople would be captured, and they, too, be overwhelmed by these new Mohammedan enemies. The passionate religious zeal of the Middle Age also roused the princes and knights of Europe to try to wrest from the infidel the Holy Land of Palestine, where were the birthplace of Christianity and the site of the sepulchre of Christ. Palestine was recovered, and Christian states were established there, which lasted for over 180 years. Then the Arab power Ramadan, operating from Egypt, finally reached Jerusalem and expelled the Christian from the Holy Land, to which he has never yet returned as a conqueror. Effects of the Crusades. These long, holy wars, or crusades, had a profound effect upon Europe. The rude Christian warrior from the west was astonished and delighted with the splendid and luxurious life which he met at Constantinople and the Arabian East. Even though he was a prince, his life at home was barren of comforts and beauty. Glass, linen, rugs, tapestries, silk, cotton, spices, and sugar were some of the things which the Franks and the Englishmen took home with them from the Holy Land. Demand for these treasures of the East became irresistible, and trade between Western Europe and the East grew rapidly. The commercial cities of Italy. The cities of Italy developed this commerce. They placed fleets upon the Mediterranean. They carried the Crusaders out and brought Europe and the Far East about 140 AD 49. Back to where had Europe desired. In this way, these cities grew and became very wealthy. On the west coast, where this trade began, were Amalfi, Pisa, Genoa, and Florence, and on the east, at the head of the Adriatic, was Venice. The rivalry between these cities of Italy was very fierce. They fought and plundered one another, each striving to win a monopoly for itself of this invaluable trade. Venice, finally, was victorious. Her location was very favorable. From her docks, the wares could be carried easily and by the shortest routes of the Po River and thence into France or northward over the Alps to the Danube. In Bavaria grew up in this trade the splendid German cities of Augsburg and Nuremberg, which passed these goods on to the cities of the Rhine, and so down this most beautiful river to the coast. Here the towns of Flanders and of the Low Countries, or Holland, received them and passed them on again to England and eastward to the countries of the Baltic. Developed a modern language. Thus commerce and trade grew up in Europe, and, with trade and city life, greater intelligence, learning, and independence. education became more common, and the universities of Europe were thronged. Latin in the Middle Age has been the only language that was written by the learned class. Now the modern languages of Europe took their form and began to be used for literary purposes.
Bone
Italian was
legs.
the first to be so used by the great Dante, and in the same half-century the English poet Chaucer sang in the homely English tongue, and soon in France, Germany, and Spain national literatures appeared. With this went greater freedom of expression. Authority began to have less weight. Men began to inquire into causes and effects, to doubt. H. H. M. H. H. B. O. R. F. A. M. W. H. W. N. H. T. F. Europe and the Far East about 480-51. Certain things, to seek themselves for the truth, and so the Renaissance
Please
came.
don't kill me.
There became a greater love for the beautiful, a greater joy in life, a fresh zest for the good of this world, a new passion for discovery, a thirst for adventure, and, it must also be confessed, a new laxity of beauty and a new greed for gold. Christian Europe was about to burst its narrow bounds. It could not be repressed nor confined to its old limitations. It could never turn backward. Of all the great changes which have come over life and thought, probably none are greater than those which saw the transition from the medieval to the modern world. Trade with the East. Articles of trade. Now we must go back for a moment and pursue an old inquiry further. Whence came all these beautiful and inviting wares that had produced new tastes and passions in Europe? The Italian traders drew them from the Levant, but the Levant had not produced them. Neither pepper, spices, sugarcane, costly gems, nor rich silks were produced on the shores of the Mediterranean. Only the rich tropical corn trees of the East were capable of growing these rare plants, and up to that time of delivering to the Delta many precious stones. India, the rich Malaysian archipelago, the kingdom of China. These are the lands and islands which from time immemorial have given up their treasures to be forwarded far and wide to amaze and delight the native of colder and less productive lands. Routes of trade to the Far East. 3 old sailing and caravan routes connect the Mediterranean with the Far East. They are so old that we cannot guess when men first used them. They were old in the days of Solomon and indeed very ancient when Alexander died. 52 Tuesday, Philippines. Great conquered the East. One of these routes passed through the Black Sea and around the Caspian Sea to test into those strange and romantic ancient cities, Bukhara and Samarkand. Thence it ran easterly across Asia, entering China from the north. Another crossed Syria and went down through Mesopotamia to the Indian Ocean. A third began in Egypt and went through the Red Sea, passing along the coast of Arabia to India. All of these had been in use for centuries, but by the year 1402 had been closed. A fresh generation of Turks, the Ottomans, in the 14th century came down upon the scourged country of the Euphrates and Syria, and although these Turks also embraced Mohammedanism, their hostility closed the first 2 routes and commerce over them has never been fully resumed. Phoenician monopoly of trade. Thus all interest centered upon the southern route. By treaty with the Sultan or ruler of Egypt, Venice secured the monopoly of the products which came over this route. Goods from the east now came in fleets of the Red Sea, went through the hands of the Sultan of Egypt, who collected a duty for them, and then were passed on to the ships of the wealthy Phoenician merchant princes, who carried them throughout Europe. Although the object of intense jealousy, it seemed impossible to wrest this monopoly from Venice. Her fleet was the strongest on the Mediterranean, and her rule extended along the Adriatic to the Grecian islands. All eager minds were bent upon the trade with the east, but no way was known, save that which now Venice had gained. Extensive geographical knowledge. The maps of this critical. To realize how the problem looked to the sailor of general and merchant commanders at that time. Europe and the Far East Gaucho OAB 53. We must understand how scanty and erroneous was the geographical knowledge of even the 15th century. It was believed that Jerusalem was the center of the world, heavily founded upon a biblical passage. The maps of this and earlier dates represented Europe in this way, in the center, Palestine, and beneath it the Mediterranean Sea, the only body of water, which was well known. On the left side is Europe. On the right, Africa. And at the top, Asia. The last 2 continents very definitely mapped. Around the whole was supposed to flow an ocean, beyond the first few miles of which it was perilous to proceed lest the ship be carried over the edge of the earth or encounter other perils. Ideas about the earth. The Greek philosophers before the time of Christ had discovered that the world was a globe, or ball, and had even computed through its circumference. But in the Middle Ages this knowledge had been disputed and contradicted by a geographer named Plotinus, who held that the world was a vast plain, twice as long as it was broad and surrounded by an ocean. This belief was generally adopted by churchmen, who were the only scholars of the Middle Ages, and came to be the universal belief of Christian Europe. The Renaissance revived the knowledge of the writings of the old Greek geographers who had demonstrated the Earth's shape to be round and had roughly calculated its size. But these writings did not have sufficient circulation in Europe to gain much acceptance among the Christian cosmographers. The Arabs, however, after conquering Egypt, Syria, and northern Africa, translated into their own tongue the wisdom of the Greeks and became the best informed and most scientific geographers of the Middle Age, so that intercourse with the Arabs which, 54 the Philippines, began with the Crusades helped to acquaint Europe somewhat with India and China. The Far East, the Tatar Mongols. Then in the 13th century all northern Asia and China fell under the power of the Tatar Mongols. Russia was overrun by them and Western Europe led. At the Danube, however, this tide of Asiatic conquest stopped, and then followed a long period when Europe came into diplomatic and commercial relations with these Mongols and through them learned something of China. Marco Polo visits the Great Khan. Several Europeans visited the courts of the Great Khan, or Mongol king, and of one of them, Marco Polo, we must speak in particular. He was a Phoenician, and when a young man started in 1271 with his father and uncle on a visit to the Great Khan, they passed from Italy to Syria, across to Baghdad, and down to Ormuz, whence they journeyed northward through Upper Persia and thence across the Thunders along the caravan route to Tabingu, where the Khan had his courts. Here in the service of his prince Marco Polo spent over 17 years. So valuable indeed were his services that the Khan would not permit him to return. Year after year he remained in the east. He traversed most of China and was for a time Teton, or magistrate, of the city of Yanchang near the Yangtze River. He saw the amazing wonders of the east. He heard of Zipangu, or Japan. He probably heard of the Philippines. Finally, the opportunity came for the three nations to return. The Great Khan had a relative who was a ruler of Persia, and ambassadors came from this ruler to secure a Mongol princess for him to marry. The dangers and hardships of the travel overland were considered too. Europe and the Far East about 55. Difficult for the delicate princess, and it was decided to send her by water. Marco Polo and his father and uncle were commissioned to accompany the expedition to Persia. History of Marco Polo's travels. They sailed from the port of Chinchu, probably near Amoy, in the year 1292. They skirted the coasts of Cambodia and Siam and reached the eastern coasts of Sumatra, where they waited 5 months for the changing of the monsoon. Of the Malay people of Sumatra, as well as of these islands, their animals and productions, Marco Polo has left us most interesting and quite ACCMA accounts. The Malays on Sumatra were beginning to be converted to Mohammedanism, for Marco Polo says that many of them were Saracens. He gained a good knowledge of the rich and mysterious Indian lands, where the spices and flavorings grew. It was 2 years before the party, having crossed the Indian Ocean, reached Persia and court of the Persian king. When they arrived, they found that while they were making this long voyage, the Persian king had died. But they married the Mongol princess to his son, the young prince, who had succeeded him, and that did just as well. From Persia, the Venetians crossed to the Black Sea, sailed for Italy, and at last reached home after an absence of 24 years. But Marco Polo's adventures did not end with his return to Venice. In a fierce sea fight between the Venetians and Genoese, he was made. See Marco Polo for a discussion of THS Point and 4. The entire history of this great explorer, as well as its translation of his Arabic. The book of Sir Marco Polo has been most critically edited with introduction and voluminous notes by this English scholar, Sir Henry Yule. In this edition, the accounts of Marco Polo, covering so many countries and peoples of the Far East, can be studied. 56 TNS by PPINSS. A prisoner and confined in Genoa. Here, a fellow captive wrote down from Marco's own words the story of his eastern adventures, and this book we have today. It is a record of adventure, travel, and description, so wonderful that for years it was doubted and its accuracy disbelieved. But since, in our own time, men have been able to traverse again the routes over which Marco Polo passed, fact after fact has been established, quite as he truthfully stated them centuries ago. To have been the first European to make this mighty circuit of travel is certainly a strong title to enduring fame. Countries of the Far East. India. Let us now briefly look at the countries of the Far East, which by the year 1400 had come to exercise over the mind of the Europeans so irresistible a fascination. First of all, India, as we have seen, had for centuries been the principal source of the Western commerce. But long before the debut of the Syrians, the scepter of India had fallen from the hand of the Hindu. From the 7th century, India was a prey to Mohammedan conquerors, who entered from the northwest into the valley of the Indus. At first these were Saracens or Arabs. Later they were the same Mongol converts to Mohammedanism, whose attacks upon Europe we have already noticed. In 1398 came the furious and bloody warrior, the greatest of all Mongols, Timur, or Tamerlane. He founded, with the capital at Delhi, the empire of the Great Mogul, whose rule over India was only broken by the white man. Eastward across the Ganges and the Deccan, or the southern part of India, were states ruled over by Indian princes. China. We have seen how, at the time of Marco Polo, China also was ruled by the Tartar Mongols. Europe and Far East about 2080 57. Chinese have ever been subject to attack from the land-bearing horse-riding tribes of Siberia. 200 years before Christ, one of the Chinese kings built the Great Wall that stretches across the northern frontier for 1,300 miles, for a defense against more burn elves. Through much of their history, the Chinese have been ruled by aliens, as they are today. About 1368, however, the Chinese overthrew the Mongol rulers and established the Ming Dynasty, the last Chinese house of emperors who ruled China until 1644, when the Manchus, the present rulers, conquered the country. China was great and prosperous under the Mings. Commerce flourished and fleets of Chinese jumped sailed to India, the Malay Islands, and to the Philippines for trade. The Grand Canal, which connects between the Yangtze River Basin and Hangzhou, was completed. It was a major part of productions of literature. The Chinese seem to have been much less exclusive then than they are at the present time. Much less a peculiar, isolated people than now. They did not then shave their heads nor wear a queue. These customs, as viewed as an hostility to foreign interests which they have today, WFERE forced upon China by the Manchus. China appeared at that time ready to assume a position of enormous influence among the peoples of the earth, a position for which she was well fated by the great industry of all classes and the high intellectual power of her learned men. Japan. Compared with China or India, or even some minor states, the development of Japan at this time is very backward. Her people were divided and there was constant civil war. The Japanese borrowed their civilization from the Chinese. From them they learned writing. Europe and the Far East about 400 AD 59. And literature, and the Buddhist regiment, which was introduced about 550 AD. But in temperament they are a very different people, being spirited, warlike, and, until recent years, have despised trading and commerce. Since the beginning of her history, Japan has been monarchical. The ruler, Mikado, is believed to be of heavenly descent. But in the centuries we are discussing, the government was controlled by powerful nobles, known as the shoguns, who kept the emperors in retirement in the palaces of Kyoto, and themselves directed the state. The greatest of these shoguns was Ieyasu, who ruled Japan about 1600, soon after Manila was founded. They developed in Japan a species of feudalism, the great lords, or daimyos, owning allegiance to the shoguns, and about the daimyos, as feudal retainers, bodies of samurai, who formed a partly noble class of their own. The samurai carried arms, fought at their lord's command, were students and literati, and among them developed the proud, loyal, and elevated code of morality known as Bushido, which has done so much for the Japanese people. It is the samurai class who in modern times have affected the immense revolution in the condition and power of Japan. Familiar Archipelago. If now we look at the Malay Islands, we find, as we have already seen, that changes had been effected there. Hinduism had first elevated and civilized at least a portion of the race, and Mohammedanism and the daring seamanship of the Malay had united these islands under a common language and religion. There was, however, no political union. The Malay Peninsula was divided. Java formed the central Malay power. Eastward among the beautiful Salids and Malackas, the true Spice Islands, were a multitude of small native rulers, Rajas or Dagas, who surrounded themselves with retain. 60 the Philippines. First, kept rude forts, and gathered wealthy tributes of cinnamon, nutmegs, and cloves. The sultans of Ternate, Tidore, and Amboina were especially powerful, and the islands they organized, rich and productive. Between all these islands there was a busy commerce. The Malay is an intrepid sailor, and an eager trader. Fleets of praus, laden with goods, passed with the chiming monsoons from part to part, risking perils of piracy, which have always troubled this archipelago. Borneo, while the largest of all these islands, was the least developed, and down to the present day has been hardly explored. The Philippines were also outside of most of this busy intercourse and had at that day few products to offer for trade. Their main connection with the rest of the Malay race was through the Mohammedan ways of Java and Borneo. The fame of the Spice Islands had long filled Europe, but the existence of the Philippines was unknown. Summary. We have now reviewed the condition of Europe and of Far Asia as they were before the period of modern discovery and colonization opened. The East had reached a condition of quiet stability. Mohammedanism, though still spreading, did not promise to effect great social changes. The institutions of the East had become fixed in custom and her peoples neither made changes nor desired them. On the other hand, Western Europe had become aroused to an excess of ambition. New ideas, new discoveries and inventions were moving the nations to activity and change. That era of modern discovery and progress, of which we cannot yet foresee the end, had begun. Chapter 4: The Great Geographical Discoveries. An Eastern Passage to India. The Pachalis. We have seen in the last chapter how Venice held the monopoly of the only trading route with the Far East. Some new way of reaching India must be sought that would permit the traders of other Christian powers to reach the market of New Orleans without passing through Mohammedan lands. This surpassing achievement was accomplished by the Portuguese. So low at the present day has the power of Portugal fallen that few realize the daring and courage once displayed by her seamen and soldiers and the unannounced colonial empire that she established. Portugal freed her territory of the Mohammedan Moors nearly a century earlier than Spain. And the vigor and intelligence of the great king, John I, brought Portugal, about the year 1400, to an important place among the states of Europe. This king captured from the Moors the city of Ceuta, in Morocco. And this was the beginning of modern European colonial possessions, and almost the first land outside of Europe to be held by a European power since the times of the Crusades. King John's youngest son was Prince Henry, famous in history under the title of the Navigator. This young prince, with something of the same impetuous spirit that drove the Crusaders, was ardent to extend the power of his father's kingdom and to widen the sway of the religion which he devotedly professed. The power of the Mohammedans in the Mediterranean was too great for him hopefully to oppose, and so he planned a conquest of the west coast. 61. 62 The Philippines of Africa, and its conversion to Christianity. With these ends in view, he established at Point Sagres, on the southwestern coast of Portugal, a naval academy and observatory. Here he brought together skilled navigators, charts, and geography, and all scientific knowledge that would assist in his undertaking. He began to construct ships larger and better than any in use. To us they would doubtless seem very clumsy and small, but this was the beginning of ocean shipbuilding. The compass and the astrolabe, or sextant, the little instrument with which, by calculating the height of the sun above the horizon, we can tell distance from the equator, were just coming into use. These, as we knew as every other practicable device for navigation known at that time, were supplied to these ships. Exploration of the African coast. Thus equipped and ably manned, the little fleets began the exploration of the African coast, cautiously feeling their way southward and never returning with reports of progress made. Year after year this work went on. In 1419 the Madeira Islands were rediscovered and colonized by Portuguese settlers. The growing of sugarcane was begun, and vines were brought from Burgundy and planted there. See the noted work of Michael Prince Henry of Portugal, Remains a Navigator, and its results, by Richard Henry Major, London, 1868. Many of the views of Mr. Major upon the importance of Prince Henry's work, and especially its early aims, have been contradicted in more recent writings. The importance of the Sagres Observatory is belittled. Doubts are expressed as to the far-sightedness of Prince Henry's plans, and the best opinion of today holds that he did not hope to discover a new route to India by way of Africa, but sought simply the conquest of the Guinea, which was known to the Europeans through the Arab geographers, who called it Bagana or Land of Wealth. The students, if possible, should read the essay of Mr. E.J. Payne, The Age of Discovery, in the Cambridge Modern History, Vol. I. The Great Geographical Discoveries. 63. Wine of the Madeiras has been famous to this day. Then were rediscovered the Canaries, and in 1444 the Azores. The southward exploration of the coast of the mainland steadily continued until in 1445 the Portuguese reached the mouth of the Senegal River. Up to this point the African shore had not yielded much of interest to the Portuguese UESC explorer or trader. Below Morocco the Great Sahara Desert reaches to the sea and renders barren the coast for hundreds of miles. South of the mouth of the Senegal and comprising the whole Guinea coast, Africa is tropical, well-watered, and populous. This is the home of the true African Negro. Here, for almost the first time, since the beginning of the Middle Ages, Christian Europe came in contact with a race of ruder culture and different color than its own. This coast was found to be worth exploiting. For it yielded, besides various desirable resin stones, 3 articles which have distinguished the exploitation of Africa, namely, gold, ivory, and slaves. Beginning of Negro slavery in Europe. At this point begins the horrible and revolting story of European Negro slavery. The ancient world had practiced this ownership of human chattels, and the Roman Empire had declined under a dent of half the population sunk in bondage. To the enormous detriment and suffering of mankind, Muhammad had tolerated the institution, and slavery is permitted by the Quran. But it is the glory of the medieval church that it abolished human slavery from Christian Europe. However dreary and unjust few days it may have been, it knew nothing of that institution which degrades men and women to the level of cattle and remorselessly sells the husband from his family, the mother from her child. 6J, Tuesday, Philippines. Slaves in Portugal. The arrival of the Portuguese upon the coast of Guinea now revived not the bondage of one white man to another, but that of the black to the white. The first slaves carried to Portugal were regarded simply as objects of peculiar interest, captives to represent to the court the population of those shores which had been added to the Portuguese dominion. But southern Portugal, from which the Moors had been expelled, had suffered from a lack of laborers, and it was found profit able to introduce Negroes to work these fields. Arguments to justify slavery. So arose the institution of Negro slavery, which a century later upon the shores of the New World was to develop into so tremendous and terrible a thing. Curiously enough, religion was evoked to justify this enslavement of the Africans. The church taught that these people, being heathen, were fortunate to be captured by Christians, that they might thereby be brought to baptism and conversion. For it is better for the body to perish than for the soul to be cast into hell. At a later age, when the falsity of this teaching had been realized, men still sought to justify the institution by arguing that the Almighty had created the African of a low estate especially that he might serve the superior race. The coast of Guinea continued to be the resort of slavers down to the middle of the last century, and such scenes of cruelty, wickedness, and debauchery had occurred along its shores as can scarcely be paralleled in brutality in the history of any people. The Portuguese can hardly be said to have colonized the coast in the sense of raising up their Portuguese population. As he approached the equator, the white man found that, in spite of his superior strength, he could not. The GTL, CFEO, and RAPM count as copies. 65. Permanently people of the tropics. Diseases new to his experience attacked him. His energy declined. If he brought his family with him, his children were few or feeble, and shortly his race had died out. The settlements of the Portuguese were largely for the purposes of trade. At Sierra Leone, Cameroon, or Bongo, they built forts and established garrisons, mounting pieces of artillery that gave them advantage over the attacks of the natives, and erecting warehouses and willows in Barracoon, where the slaves were confined to await shipment. Such decadent little settlements still linger along the African coast, although the ocean slave trade happily has ended. The South SSFUL voyage of Vasco da Gama. Throughout the century, Prince Henry's policy of exploration was continued. Slowly, the middle coast of Africa became known. At last in 1487, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the extremity of the continent. He named it the Cape of Storms. But the Portuguese king, with more pathetic vision, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. It was 10 years, however, before the Portuguese could send another expedition. Then Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape again, followed up the eastern coast until the Arab trading stations were reached. Then he struck across the sea, landed at the Malabar coast of India, and in 1498 arrived at Calicut. The end dreamed of by Oliver had been achieved. A sea route to the Far East had been discovered.
Time to
Results of
go.
da Gama's voyage. The importance of his performance was instantly recognized in Europe.
See you next